get us started, some of y'all weren't here the last time I did a talk, so I want to just recap what I covered. I won't go into everything. There is a video online that you can watch when you get home. But just real quickly, last time we talked, I contrasted, okay, what does the world say about sex? And then why are we in a position to have a great understanding of sex that totally beats that? So first I looked at, okay, the world says that one, sex is all about whatever feels good for you. So you just explore. It doesn't matter how many people. It doesn't matter who those people are. It doesn't matter if it's even with people. You do what you got to do to explore yourself sexually. And if we repress that, it's actually hurting ourselves, right? If we're not acting out that sexuality, that component of who we are causing ourselves real damage. Okay? I heard it a lot when I was choosing not to have sex. People were like, you must be so sexually frustrated. No, not really. But that's sort of the understanding, right? If you're not living this out, then clearly something is not healthy in you. You're not understanding who you were made to be. We're also told that, you know what, sex is just the end. Sex is not a means to an end. Sex in the world's understanding is not about relationship. It's not about intimacy. It's about what you can get in that moment. It's not about the children that may come from that. It's not about how it will leave that person. But sex is the end. That's it, right? You just have it, you enjoy it for the moment, and then you keep moving. And just don't look back to see the damage potentially behind you. And then finally, sex is a need, right up there, and I want to touch on that later today, but sex is this need up there with eating and drinking, and so we have to be sexual beings. And I agree that we are sexual beings, but it's how we express that. And then we had to look at the lies of what this has caused. You know, we're told that sex is great and it's the end, and you have to express it, but we're not told about the sexually transmitted diseases. We're not told about how pornography causes addiction, how it warps our understanding of sex and sexuality and relationships and affects our marriages. We're not hearing that side of the equation, right? We're not hearing about the divorces because of pornography. We're not hearing about the people who've got so much past that they don't even know how to move forward, and they're walking around like deserts, right? Just dried out, no pun intended. Just not healthy and alive, right? We're not hearing that part of sex. We're not hearing that story. And so my hope is that the church will begin to bring a message of sex that is very upfront, that doesn't shy away from talking about it, and that in fact is the ones that we're the most excited about sex. I mean, could you imagine what it would mean if the church were the ones that were sex positive? The rest of the world would have nothing to hold up against that. Because if suddenly we begin to come at it from what I believe is the only position that the church can bring, right, which covers physical, emotional, and spiritual, we have a way of bringing it that the world will never be able to touch. And so as Joanna said, she wanted me to go deeper, so we're going to go deeper today. So looking at, okay, what would it mean if the church had the best position on sex? What would that position be? I believe that that position on sex would be one that elevates it without idealizing it. I think we have taken sex, and it is so one-dimensional, and while the world thinks it's elevated it, it has actually taken it and sort of thrown it in the dirt. And I think it's time for the church to pick it back up and say, we are going to be the ones that know what sex should be about. And we are going to be the ones that know how to talk about this in a way that encompasses the whole person. So to start us off, we're going to start with the most obvious, which is physical, because sex is physical, right? At least for most people. So sex being physical starts not actually in the actual act, it starts in the urges and the desires. And I think that's where the church has got to start. And when I say church, by the way, I mean anybody who is a follower of Jesus Christ. It is not about denomination, right? It is not about whether you are a Catholic or whether you are Jewish or what. It is anybody who is a follower of Jesus Christ and says, I am seeking to live the way Christ lived in this world. That is what I mean by the church. So that should encompass a lot of people, right? So we're starting with urges and desires, and we all have them. Yes? Anybody in this room have sexual urges and desires? Okay, 3 of you. Good. At least we can meet up later. Yes, we have them. And unfortunately, I think the church has come to say that is bad. Like, that is not okay, that you feel this, that you want that, you need to suppress that. Whether we have said it overtly or just kind of in subtext, we've said that that is the sin. Wanting sex is the sin. If you have any desire, if you even think about this, you've sinned. And I would say no, that is normal. Like, you were created to want sex. We would have not gotten very far if Adam and Eve had not wanted sex. You can thank your parents for having wanted sex at some point, right? I mean, if people don't want sex, then at some point things are going to kind of break down. So God wired us to desire that intimacy, to desire that act. So the desire is not bad. It's what we do with that desire. And I think first we have to start approaching that in the church to say, wanting this is not a bad thing. It's how do we channel that? How do we focus that, right? And I think unfortunately what that has created, as I've worked with young people, you suppress it. You pretend, no, there's nothing wrong. I don't want this. But then it ends up blowing up in your face because you can only push it down so long before it's going to explode, right? So instead, we have to raise up a generation that understands, yes, it is good that I want sex. I want sex someday. I want it to be great. But I'm waiting for what I know will be the best sex possible, right? And I think that's where we have to start, is realizing that wanting sex is not a bad thing, okay? Wanting it to be pleasurable for both sexes is not a bad thing. Right? But it's in the right context. We channel that desire to be about so much more than just what we can get in this moment. See, what we've kind of missed is that we control our urges. The urges don't control us. Right? So having that desire isn't something to be afraid of, like, oh no, I'm about to be taken over. No, you still get to control it. You're the one taking your clothes off. Right? It's not that urge, like something's happening. You take those clothes off. You decide to follow through on that. So we control the urges. And to be honest, that's not like a foreign concept to the world. We've grown up, especially living in Los Angeles. We grow up where it is all about you suppress, you control an urge because you're wanting something better. Think about all the yoga studios, and all the Pilates, and all the workouts, and all the diets. Aren't you giving up in the moment what you want because you know something better is coming? You give up that piece of chocolate cake because you want to fit into those size whatever jeans. So this is a concept that the world understands. Unfortunately, somehow we separated that when it came to sex. With sex, you give into that urge, right? You're taken over. But we have to remember that no, we control that. That urge does not control us. We control the urge. And so if we can begin to talk about it, but in a positive way, that is, I think, where we have sort of failed the world, is that we've swung, and I know why we've done it. I mean, I'm a pastor's kid. I've grown up in the church. The world took the position, sex is all good all the time. And so we felt like, okay, in order to balance that, we're just going to go over here. So we're going to say sex is never good unless you're married and you're going to have children, or those urges and all of that. And I know that there are a lot of fabulous people who are right here in the middle who get it, right? But I think we as a church and as a body of believers have to begin to talk about this positively. We know in our hearts and our minds that urge can't be bad, right? But how I deal with it, I have to learn to bring that back to the foot of the cross. But we have to learn how to talk about it in a way to those around us, not, I'm not having sex because God has called me to die to myself. Like, who wants that? I don't, okay? Like, nobody wants that version. You're like, well, I can't wait for you to get married. I mean, it's just not exciting. No wonder people aren't signing up, because the way we talk about it does not match up with what people have experienced. And instead, we need to be talking about it positively. Be like, yes, we know sex is great. We are so excited. Those of us who are married know sex is great. And that's why we want you to wait for the best. And that is why our marriages have to have great sex. Right? We cannot be putting this forward like there's great sex available for you, and then all of our marriages are falling apart in divorce because they're not having sex. So there's work to be done there. As a married woman, I know. Right? And in fact, sex is an indicator of how your marriage is doing, right? If you tell me how your sex life is in your marriage, I will tell you how your marriage is. And so even as we're talking more positively about this, we have also got to live that out. And that's the second part of this conversation at some later date, is to really build up the marriages, to help our married people have great sex. Those of you that are married, I say this every time I talk, go home and do it tonight. And those of you that are not married, when you get married, make an effort to have great sex. Have quick sex, right? Have sex. You have to make a point. But that, again, starts because how we look at it has to change. We've got to start seeing that it's a positive that just has to be channeled in the right instances. And then last point on that, I will say, I know we all have baggage going into our relationships associated with sex, even if you have never had sex. When I got married, I had never had sex. I called my dad 4 days before I got married. I said, I can't do this. It's like, why? It's like, because I'm going to have sex. There's been a good boundary. Don't cross that. And now there will be no boundary. And I can't say no. And I don't think I can do that. I don't want it. Nope. Because I had swung the other way of like, well, I'm not having sex, but now sex is this thing that for so long you don't do. But in my own heart, I had gone to that point where like the whole thing is a mess. It's just bad, right? And so all of us are going to come into our marriages, whether you've never had sex, whether you've had sex with half the town, whether you've had sex with both sides. Like, you're going to bring it in, okay? And the church has to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that there is sexual baggage, right? We have to acknowledge that there is this baggage, which is why we can no longer afford to be silent. When we're talking about urges, when we're talking about desires, when we're talking about pornography in our churches, this is all carrying into our relationships. Whether you are dating or you are married, this matters, right? And so we first have to address the physical aspect of sex, that people in our church have had sex, that they are having sex, right? So that's where we have to start. But if sex was only physical, then it wouldn't have a huge impact, to be honest. If sex was just a leisure activity, as I heard it called this week in an article I read, it'd be like playing tennis, okay? You just pick up your tennis partner, and then you're done. You pick up your sex partner, and then you're done. But we know it's not just physical, it's also emotional. Or you wouldn't be here right now, right? You wouldn't be here because it'd be like, well, I don't have people in my congregation that are hurting. I'm not hurting. But we are hurting, and we have friends that are hurting because we know sex is also emotional. Studies have shown that women, particularly, sorry gentlemen, I'm going to go to the women, but this matters for you men, that women in particular who have engaged in casual sex and did it, just because they wanted to do it, actually end up having, and I'm going to quote this, feeling emotionally vulnerable and anxious when they weren't sure if their partner had the same level of commitment. See, if sex was purely physical, they wouldn't feel anxious. Even if their partner wasn't committed. You'd be like, okay, that's fine. You can have another tennis partner, I don't care. But because it is emotional, they are having those feelings. And having more partners didn't get rid of that, it only made it worse. And this wasn't just among the women, who'd grown up in the church and were these sexual prudes that like flipped in one night. This was among women who the world would say, you know what, you've got a fairly progressive, liberal sexual morality. Across the board, we're feeling this. Even people that want to say sex is just two bodies. No, sex is two bodies and two souls and two hearts coming together, right? As one college student said in an article, she said, we are told not to be sexual prudes, but in order to have casual sex, we have to be emotional prudes. I thought that summed it up so well. And that's why we as a church are positioned to tell this world it's a good thing that you feel something in your heart when you have sex. It is a good thing that you desire that person because you were created for that. Sex was supposed to be about pulling you towards another individual. I've talked before on what our brain does and the chemistry in the brain, and that we actually release chemicals in our brain when we orgasm that bond us to that person because we were created to feel something, right? And we're able to tell the world, look, we don't want you to have to emotionally shut off when you are physically turned on. We want you to be able to bring the whole person. But we want you to be safe in that emotionally. It's not just about safe sex of the body, right? It's about safe sex of the heart. And the only place that is going to happen is where you know that person is committed to you, where you know that person has trial by fire proven themselves, where you know that person is going to be there tomorrow even if the sex is not so great. If you wake up and they realize you don't always look like that, right? Okay, so that's what we're helping the world to see. We want this for you, but it happens in a particular context, and that particular context is marriage. That's why we encourage people to wait till marriage. Not because it's like, well, God set up these rules and he thought it'd be a real kick to pump people full of hormones and be like, don't do it. No! I mean, I'm sorry, there's only like one verse of Jesus being a teenager and he grew in wisdom. And you're like, what about the part with the hormones? Okay? And that's like never covered. But we gotta believe he went through the same stuff we did. So we have not been pumped full of hormones and desires for sex if there's not an appropriate place for that to be experienced and realized. And so in talking about it to the world, we're saying we don't just want you to have the best physical sex, right? We want you to have the best emotional sex, but that can only happen when you feel safe. And that's only going to really happen in marriage. And again, it comes back to our marriages then have to show that. But it's another talk for another day, right? So you've got the physical and you've got the emotional. We want sex to be about connecting. We get to talk about all the things that we want sex to be. Do you see how this is positive? This is what the world wants, right? But we're the only ones uniquely positioned to speak that, okay? But in the same way sex is not just physical, sex is also emotional, and it's spiritual. I believe that there are 3 components every time that come into play when we have sex. And this is where the world does not have a place to stand because they cannot speak on this. C.S. Lewis, to paraphrase him greatly, he says, you have a body, but you are a soul. And every person we come in contact with is a soul. And they bear the fingerprints of God all over them. I think that's another C.S. Lewis quote. And I love that. Every person that we are in relationship with, every person that we get naked with, has a soul that just happens to be in a body, right? And that is where we are going to bring that rain into people's lives, to bring that freshness. Because casual sex has so long left people broken. Not everyone, but the majority of people broken. Because it's affecting them on a spiritual level, and they don't know about that, right? And we have that hope. We're able to say, this is why sex, and this is how sex can fulfill you on every level. So that means, though, we're going to have to not be afraid to talk about the fact that people are spiritual beings. Not in a creepy, weird, fanatic way, but just to understand you have purpose. Because what it says is when we bring in the spiritual and the sacramental, it's to say, look, you were made by a creator who knew exactly what he was doing. You were not an accident. You were not unexpected, right? You have a purpose. You are not just a mass of cells put together, but instead you are a human being who's been created to feel, to experience life, right? And you bear the image of the holy. And that is why we have got to talk about the spiritual, because in talking about the spiritual aspect of sex, we actually elevate the individual. Does that make sense? So where the world says sex is purely physical, it's because all it can say to the person is, you are just, from dust to dust. That's it. But we're saying, yes, you are physical, but you are emotional and you are spiritual. I believe, and I believe there are a lot of people that agree, if you look at scripture, that when we engage in sex, we don't form just a physical connection, we are forming an emotional and a spiritual connection. And the things that we do on this side of heaven, we have no idea what is happening on the other side. C.S. Lewis, again, says that if Christianity is to be true, then that means that there's got to be bits of the eternal world sticking out into ours, like levers. And we're just pulling on them, and we don't know what it's doing in heaven. And I think that is never more true than in sex. We think it's just 2 bodies, but we've got to help the world see, no, you are forming, as Ia will say later, a soul tie to that person. But the amazing thing that the church offers is not just well, too bad for you, you just formed a soul tie. Good luck with that. No, we get to come in and also say, but maybe that was not the best soul tie, right? Maybe that was not the one to get connected, or those 10 were not the ones to get connected to. We can redeem that relationship, and that is also our message, a message of hope. Because there are a lot of people walking around broken, and we get to come in and say, whatever your experiences have been, that does not define your future. So our message of sex has got to be sex positive, saying how great it's going to be, how great it is. We know that, and we want you to enjoy the best without the pain, literally and figuratively. We want you to feel something. We don't want you to have to separate who you are in that moment. And we want you to also be able to understand that there is spiritual implication to what is happening. Right? Our understanding of sex actually sets people free. Our understanding of sex allows people to be all that they were created to be, to enjoy that in the moment, and to be able to invest in that relationship and experience the best sex God has for them. And I think if the church begins to talk about it this way, we begin to be sex positive, covering all these aspects because we're covering the whole person, then I think we will be giving an understanding of sex that the world and the church will find irresistible.